for joining the Broadway Drumming 101 podcast with your host, Clayton Craddock.
Born and raised in Hastings-on-Hudson, New York, Clint de Ganon was 6 years old when he started playing drums. Clint studied drumset with many great teachers in high school, including the great Sonny and Gary Chester. After moving to New York City, Clint met bassist Gordon Edwards at a jam session at Mikell's. Gordon introduced Clint to Cornell Dupree. This meeting led to many opportunities to perform and record with an incredible list of artists: Cissy Houston, Brooke Benton, John Tropea, the Manhattan Transfer, the Fab Faux, Lloyd Price, Bob James, Chuck Loeb, Michael Franks, Will Lee, Hiram Bullock, Blood, Sweat and Tears, Stuff, Tom Scott, Liza Minnelli, Phoebe Snow, Tony Conniff, Christopher Cross, the Blues Brothers, Take Six, Renée Fleming, Paula Cole, Donovan, Elvis, Costello, Dionne, Warwick, Jimmy Buffett, and the great Billy Preston, just to name a few. Clint was recently honored to be the drummer on the new Steven Spielberg remake of West Side Story and made a brief appearance in the actual movie as well. Clint held the drum chair for 13 Broadway musicals, including Beautiful, Hairspray, Catch Me If You Can, Bonnie and Clyde, Footloose, Jesus Christ Superstar, Rocky Horror Live, and many others. He originated the drum book for 9 of these shows and played drums on both the movie Hairspray and the TV show Hairspray Live. Clint proudly endorses Yamaha drums, Zildjian cymbals, ProMark drumsticks, and Attack drumheads. Ladies and gentlemen, Clint de Ganon. Welcome to Broadway Drumming 101. My guest today is the legendary Clint de Ganon.
Thanks. Good to be here, Clayton.
I'm glad you can do this. I see behind you, you have something that's very interesting. You have 2 things, but I want to talk about the first thing that's right behind you. It's a poster of Manny's Car Wash. I remember going there several times to go to their blues jam session.
Oh, did you?
Were you part of was there a house band at that time?
If there was, I didn't know about that. When I played at Manny's was it was a blues club, and you remember, and it was on the Upper East Side.
Yes,
I would play there with the band that I was working with at the time, which was the late great Hiram Bullock, and we had a trio with the great Will Lee, and we wound up doing a live record there. And this poster behind me is Live at Manny's Car Wash is the name of the record, and it was, a period of time. We had done a number of gigs, and Hiram was a one in a row, just an amazing guitar player, and some people say one of the greatest, if not the greatest, since Hendrix. It was a very creatively fertile stage, and you could and we were, We did things on that record and played songs on that record that we hadn't even rehearsed or never played before.
Oh, wow.
So Hiram was in that phase, and Will and Hiram go way back. I was kind of the new guy in the band, and they could move the thing in any different direction they wanted to. And we all sang, and that was part of it. Yeah, it was Hiram sang most of the leads, but every now and then a lead line would go to Will or me. And then when we did gigs in Japan and, got more comfortable, that was kind of the early phase of that particular trio. Then we would each sing songs, Hiram mostly, but Will and I would also have a song or 2 to sing. Anyway, it was a lot of fun. Really, really special time for me.
So not only Hiram Bullock, but the Blues Brothers, Blood, Sweat and Tears, Chuck Loeb, Curtis Stigers, Cornell Dupree, Cissy Houston, Edgar Winter, and that's just to name a few. And the shows that you've done, because this is basically dedicated to people that want to learn about Broadway musicals.
Sure.
You were on Hairspray for many, many years. Beautiful, And let me ask you one starting question. Was your first Broadway show Footloose?
No, my first Broadway show was kind of a fluky thing that came. It was called Stardust, and Stardust. I was a kid, early 20s. I had gone out with I'd gone on a tour, and the show was called The American Dance Machine. They may be around in one form or another now, but the American Dance Machine was a touring. They had a Broadway moment before I joined, but it was a touring show that took highlights of dances from different shows and pieced them together in one. And so great dancers. And the MD was a guy named Jim Raitt, who's no longer with us. He wound up getting this show, Stardust. He said, "Can you do this off-Broadway show?" I did. And it ran off-Broadway for, I don't know, maybe, I'm guessing now, a number of months, maybe 6 months, maybe more, maybe 8 months. And then it moved to Broadway and lasted, a couple months. And it was a review. And the show was lyricist Mitchell Parrish, all his songs, which included Stardust. And it was that was that. And Andre DeShields was in it. I remember so this is a long time ago. He was one of maybe the 4 featured singers. And that's what it was. It was like a Smokey Joe's Cafe format where you introduce the thing, you sing the songs. And that was my first show.
Well, let's go back to your beginning as a drummer, as a musician. You started when you were 6 years old, and you started. Did you grow up in New York City or Westchester?
Well, yeah. So I spent the first year of my life in Brooklyn. Then we went to Cincinnati, and we were there for a few years. Moved to Westchester, Hastings-on-Hudson, when I was 4. And at the time when we moved there, my best friend, was across the street. Still a very close friend of mine. His older brother played drums. He had his name's Pete Edelman. My buddy's Jeff. Anyway, he had a Champagne Sparkle kit that was either Slingerland or Rogers. I can't remember. And he played, rock beats. And I would go over to the house and I would check him out. And I was fascinated. I mean, you probably have some similar thing, some bug that bit you, where just the actual sort of physicality of the drums themselves, along with the primal nature of what it is, just grabs you, right? And that's when it grabbed me. I mean, at the time he was playing, I was probably like 4 or 5. And then my dad got me a couple of drums. It was like a bass drum and a snare drum, no pedal, no stands. And so I lay them on the floor and I sat on the floor, and, he gave me a pair of drumsticks, and I would, make beats on the bass drum lying on the floor and the snare drum lying on the floor. So ultimately I took lessons at the local music store. That was at 6 or 7 or something.
So I understand you studied with Sonny Igo. Was that?
Well, that if you fast forward, I had another teacher in between, a local guy named Phil Grice, and then at a point when it was time to move on, at Hastings there was I have to mention this guy named Pete DeLuke. He was a mentor. He was our stage band, concert band, and marching band teacher. Pete DeLuke. Who's now retired, of course, but he was a saxophone player, and he had toured with like Stan Kenton and I think Woody Herman, but some major big bands. So he had this love of teaching, and he also was a real jazz musician. So it was so fortunate for me. But anyway, he plugged into like the local guys locally who were great players. So Gene Krupa, Stan Getz, and Mel Lewis, right, were all in the periphery. Gene was in Yonkers. Stan was in Irvington, and Mel Lewis was in Tarrytown. So Mel would come and occasionally sit down with me and show me some things. And I was a kid, at the time. I mean, probably like 8th or 9th grade. When it came time to look for a teacher, I said, "Can I study with you?" He's like, "No," because he really was an unorthodox technical player, right? And he didn't teach much. And it wasn't what he was going to do, so he sent me to Sonny. You had to audition for Sonny.
Wow.
And Sonny turned people down. I mean, everybody wanted to study with Sonny. So Sonny was in the Henry Adler building. That was a building that was on 46th Street and had, at one point or another, Ed Shaughnessy and Charlie Persip, and but it was all drummers. Henry Adler, of course, was there, Sonny was at the very end of the hall, up some stairs. So I went there and sat down with him my first time. And, he said, play some of this and play some of that. And he said, "Well, Mel sent you, and you obviously have talent, but you play like a pussycat." Now, I remember the story differently. And, of course, Tommy and I have had discussions about this. I remember him not adding the word cat to the end. He thinks differently. I thought differently, but anyway, Sonny insists that he didn't say that later on. But whatever, it was I spent about 5 years studying with Sonny.
So what do you think he meant by that? You play too soft?
Yeah, I think he meant that I didn't really have a technique. My hands were not developed enough, so there was musicality for a guy that age. However, I think I might have been 16 at the time or something. But, so I would take the train in and study with him every week. And I worked with him for 4 or 5 years, even through college. And I also got a symphonic percussion, an orchestral percussion teacher at the time, a guy named Larry Wilson. Larry was a disciple of Saul Goodman's, and so was the guy I ultimately studied with, which was Roland Koloff. He was the timpanist of the New York Philharmonic. So anyway, I was doing these things because at the time when I was planning, when I went to college, playing drums as a major, if you were a music major and your ticket was the main instrument was playing drum set, in my periphery, Berkeley was the only answer. My folks were like you to get a fuller education. They were more about, so I went to the only place at the time that Koloff was teaching, and it was a liberal arts education, and it was a good one, and studied with him. And then when I was out, studied with Gary Chester for a year or two. Studied with Buster Bailey, who was many people consider like the greatest concert snare drummer. He was also in the Philharmonic for a couple of years. And ultimately, Michael Carvin, studied with him a little bit, a great jazz drummer. Those were my teachers. But I do want to tell you one thing. So in high school, the first year I got into the stage band, which was a really good band, they were like competing in the Northeast. They had come in second 2 years in a row at Berklee School of Music in the jazz band competition. By the time I got in there, Gene Krupa had already done, they had annual benefit concerts for the kids. If they went, they were going to go to school, this would help them. There was money raised from these concerts. So the kids would play in their stage band, and then these great artists would play. Unbelievable. So my first year, I was like, Gene Krupa's coming. And he couldn't come, but he had somebody drive a pair of his drumsticks to Hastings High School for the drummer that he never even met, which was truly
presented to you
on stage. Gene Krupa would like to give these drumsticks to the drummer. What a sweet man, right? So ultimately, and Mel would come every year and play, and Stan Getz would play, and Dave Brubeck played. One year, Buddy Rich came. And I was a huge Buddy Rich fan. There was a place called, he had a club called Buddy's Place. But he had actually two locations for Buddy's Place. He would play there all the time. So imagine a club called Buddy's Place where you could see Buddy playing constantly, right?
Where was it?
This one was on 60s, I want to say 61st Street and 2nd Avenue, somewhere right there. You had to walk up one flight of stairs and then you were there. At the time, he had, I want to say like a septet, which included Anthony Jackson, who was like, at the time, I think he may have been 18 or 19, no older.
Wow.
It was an unbelievable band. And I was a kid, and, sometimes Mel would take me to the Vanguard to see Thad Jones' Mel Lewis Orchestra, which ultimately became the Vanguard Orchestra. I had a rich high school experience, right? It was very nurturing. So when I was in my junior year, time for this annual concert, Buddy Rich was a guest, and Mel Lewis, and they played together on the stage. Anyway, Buddy was my idol, and I was looking for some excuse to talk to him. So I had just played, and I went over. I was like, "Mr. Rich, is there anything I can?" A little kid going over and he grabbed my hand, and he said, "Son, you're a great drummer. You keep playing." And if he had grabbed my hand and said, "Son, think about doing something else." Because Buddy was notorious, he had a temper, and he, by all accounts, he could be difficult. But that day, I saw him holding babies. He was like smiling. He was the nicest, sweetest man. And that was my experience playing for Buddy. So the next year, there was a great saxophonist arranger named Frank Foster. He lived in Scarsdale, and he brought me to a rehearsal in Harlem for some gig that was about to happen at Glen Island Casino. And he was going to have me and the tenor player play, on a tune or two at Glen Island Casino with his band. It was like the most unbelievable thing, right? So we got to Glen Island Casino, and who was the drummer that I'm listening to, and that is ultimately going to put his drumsticks down and have me come up and play? Elvin Jones.
Really? Wow.
Who was smiling and laughing, and I just remember getting behind the kid. Did you ever hear that Bill Cosby routine where, it's about where he was a drummer when he was younger, and he has to play Cherokee. He sits and he's playing ting, 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 and his hand starts to get really tired, and, he feels like it's going to fall off. And it wasn't Cherokee, but it was something like that. And I had no idea where one was. I just knew where the pulse was, and I was going like this. And Elvin was over there laughing, and, but I mean, I tell you these things because as we lead up to this other stuff, the fuel of being a musician, of being thrilled with jazz, being thrilled with music, being nurtured, studying, and following conductor also, because I played in concert band, I played in orchestra in high school, and all of that. All of it played in. I hadn't played a show yet. But I had done a lot of playing, and that continued through college.
When you were in high school, did you have dreams of being a rock star, playing in the Philharmonic, playing on Broadway, playing in jazz clubs? Did you have an ultimate goal, or was it you just wanted to play?
It's a good question. I was thrilled with music. And I always loved, I knew I wanted to be a musician. And the drums were a vehicle, because music was the bigger thing. But I wasn't really cognizant of the ways to make money. And at some point in high school, I got turned on to CTI, which was a label that produced all this great music, and you know it. And they recorded all the stuff at Rudy Van Gelder's place in Englewood, New Jersey, or Englewood Cliffs. Anyway, you could hear Bob James and Grover Washington and Freddie Hubbard and Jim Hall and Milt Jackson, all these great jazz artists. But it was a predecessor to the fusion, I think, of jazz and jazz and pop music, jazz and rock, jazz and R&B, fusion sort of. But anyway, that's the first time, and I was really into Billy Cobham at one point, and I bought one of the records. Was a Milt Jackson record called Sunflower. I had Little Sunflower on it, and Herbie and all these great drum players were on it. And Steve Gadd was on. I didn't know who Steve Gadd was, and I actually avoided listening to the I kept honing on Billy Cobham's tracks because he was playing with Mahavishnu, and then ultimately he had his own. Anyway, I heard Steve, and I was like, wow, even as a high school. And then I thought, what I really want to do is be a studio musician. Because there was something that was always more fascinating to me about playing in the recording studio and sounding good and plugging into all these different kinds of music. It was more fascinating to me than any other aspect of playing. And actually, honestly, remains so. So, I love playing live. I could sit in the studio all day, day after day. And in a way, I wish that's what New York still was, because there was a point when it was, when guys were doing that.
Some of the musicians that I speak with on this podcast were part of that scene back then. Yeah. Eventually I'd like to speak to somebody like Buddy Williams, who was like doing it all the time. Yeah. But talking to Ray Marchica and other people, he even talked about the number that was part of Radio Registry, which I keep forgetting, 212 JU
2 8800.
Yeah, something like that. 8,000.
Larry Saltzman, that might have been it. Larry Saltzman actually had it once as his email address, just to commemorate. It was, and if you know Larry, it's like, yes. Perfect. But he, it in a way, he was commemorating and celebrating that, because it was such an abundant time. When you think about it, Clayton, it wasn't that long ago that every note of music had to be made by people. I mean, we think of it as like, well, yeah, that's ancient. It's not. I mean, stuff didn't start to automate really until the 80s. I understand that's 40 years ago. 40 years ago seems like a lifetime to many. 40 years is not that long ago in the scheme of things. And then ultimately, you had drum machines that came in, and between that and many other things kind of killed the studio business as we know it. But at one point it was quite fruitful.
Did you break into the studio scene in the 70s and 80s?
I would say the answer to that question, quite honestly, is yes and no. So I was never as busy as, because I was young, right? So as I came into that scene, it was already beginning to dwindle. But I did my fair share of not records as much as jingles. And there were companies that I would work for sometimes. Even wrote one. It even went national. It's Trident. I think it was Trident. But there were guys certainly that were doing more of that for longer than I was. But I did it long enough and enjoyed it long enough to have gotten a taste of what that really was. And then it began to disappear. As it began to disappear, the prospect of doing shows became more palatable for people who ordinarily would not have appeared on that scene. You know, rhythm section players who were just too busy playing in the studios and live gigs and stuff like that, and there was really no reason to sort of move in the direction of a show. It wasn't considered what it is now. And I must admit that I carry some of that with me, that sense, because we didn't celebrate. We never, guys of my age never really celebrated. It was commerce, and we were grateful to have it. And there was certainly some music you could play that was better than others, and the level of musicians certainly went up. But we kind of knew what it was. You know what I equated to when I was doing jingles, and I was thrilled to get a jingle. It was the greatest thing in the world. I didn't give a shit that it was like a 30-second spot for, peanut butter or whatever. And, you'd look around the room and it was like my heroes were there. They didn't want it. They were looking at their watches. It was the last place they wanted to be. They wanted to make money. It was about making money, right? And they got the great players, and they were happy to be able to make the money. But what they really wanted to do is play real music, right? So in a way, I see the same dichotomy, that same sort of thing, but the jingles were ultimately replaced by shows for a bunch of us, and we were grateful and are grateful to have them, but we frame it for what it is now. If you're an actor, a whole different animal. You're the performer. This is what you're going for, and you flesh out a role and you do all that. When you're a musician, you're mostly tucked underneath a stage, playing the same 30 songs 8 times a week, right? So, yes, you bring your whole self to it. You try, you give it everything, and we could talk about all those things, but let's be honest about what it is and what it isn't. It's a gig.
Before we even go on,
Yeah.
when I got Memphis the musical, I think I might have said this on another podcast of mine. When I started seeing people coming in to sub for George,
Mm-hmm.
or for John Putnam, or Mike Aarons before he left, and all of the horn players, I was like, and I see Francisco Centeno, and then I learned that he played on so many of the songs that I grew up listening to. And then I see the guy, Ira Siegel comes in, and I'm like, he was on all the Kashif records that I listened to. And then, people that had played with Steely Dan, and I'm like, everyone is playing shows now. And I had to figure out, it's like, why? And then, people that wanted to sub for me, or I was trying to get to sub for me because I needed a black male person to sub for me. And I was asking people, and a lot of people were like, yeah, I'll come down. And all the people that I idolized, they were like, they wanted to sub for me. I'm like, it's fascinating to know that there are so many great musicians that were part of that studio scene that are now doing Broadway. And the level of musicianship, as you know, is so high that you have to, and I was like, man, I had to step it up. And I stepped it up from the beginning because it was my show, but I just wanted to be able to play at the same level as these people that I grew up listening to. And all these people are playing in pits now, and they still are. And it's just fascinating how those people are doing that. But as you say, it is a gig, but most of the time,
Yeah, the people that you just mentioned are some of the best musicians I've ever played with anywhere. So I just did. I just worked with Francisco this past weekend. We played Paul Schaefer's symphony show, and we did one gig without him just before, and it wasn't. With respect, it just wasn't half the gig that it was with him. So here's something to think about. Yes, to your point, work is work, right? So, and whereas, somebody like you and me might have come in at a point when these guys ruled, and we wanted to get into that scene, right? And we'd be good at it, right? Well, I hope that that's what people thought of me as I was doing it. But so now we reverse the thing, right? So now you're solidly in the Broadway world, right? And I'm solidly in the Broadway world, and people want to sub for us. Some people who are doing shows could never do what an Ira Siegel or a Francisco Centeno do. They haven't developed that area of their playing or any number of areas of their playing. So they could not sub for them in several other circumstances. And that will be another point I would love to discuss with you. But when you have people like that, though, and you have an MD and or composer and or orchestrator and all that, like you had a Harold Wheeler, right? Harold was the orchestrator on Hairspray. Harold really understands. Lon Hoyt was the MD. Mark Shaman. These guys really understand great playing. So you can have good players who can get the job done. Then you can have great players who are going to bring something to this thing. It's going to be way bigger than any of those people I just mentioned imagine. It's going to be bigger than that and that's why they call these people. That's why, Harold Wheeler puts the basic information on the page and expects a Francisco or me or David Spinoza who played, or John Harrington who played, to make it, more special than they could have conceived. And that's why they're smart people, So anyway, it becomes really important for people to be incredibly well-rounded and to do stuff that's not Broadway, so they can bring a point of view and experience and authenticity and creativity to a show that otherwise would not be forthcoming. You asked a question earlier, which reveals to a lot about probably my own my own trajectory and what has worked for me and maybe what hasn't worked for me in the long run, which is I wanted to be the best player I could. What did that mean? That meant, like, I had these heroes, right? We all have heroes. And to use those people as inspiration and to develop and play in situations that demand a lot of you, where you're the weakest link, and you just get better. You just get better. You get your ass kicked. You go on the road. You play a million different kinds of gigs, anywhere with anybody, all the time. Nothing is too good for you, and you keep doing it. And you go sit in like you did at Manny's, right? So I did the same thing at Mikell's, which is no longer around, but Mikell's was a special club that was on 97. It's now a Whole Foods, I think. It's on 97th Street in Columbus. But anyway, it went through a few different incarnations after that. But Mikell's was really special, and I went and sat in. There was a jam session, like I think it was on Tuesday, and it was co-led by the great Gordon Edwards, who was the leader of the band Stuff. And, we know and love Stuff. I became a member of Stuff a number of years back. Stuff is still in existence. and Elliot Randall, who was a great a great guitar player who lives in England and has been for a long time. He played Reelin' in the Years on the Steely Dan, he played solos on Fame. I think he was a great guitar player in the New York scene. So anyway, these guys hired me, right? Gordon ultimately put me in with Cornell Dupree, and I ultimately went to tour with him, did a gig at the Bottom Line years earlier. Elliot, who started a band. Ultimately, you just do different gigs, and one gig leads to another if you're good. And then you keep growing. Now, as I was preparing for this interview, Clayton, I did something I haven't ever done, which is to type out what I did in my life, in my career, because I don't like to look back. It's not like a religion. It doesn't interest me. It bores me, and I think it's going to bore everybody else. But what I found is that the things that were show related were just like other gigs. There were gigs that came along, and I took the gigs. I took the gigs because the gigs came my way. So one of the industries in New York was theater, and theater was a way to make money. And so, one off-Broadway thing led to another on-Broadway thing, et cetera, et cetera. But at every point, especially when I had to sit down and create the book, right? Which is, we could talk about that too. I'd love to talk about that. But when you do that, well, you've already created parts over and over and over and over again in every situation, because here's the fucking song. Play the song. How would you play to the song? You mean I have to tell you how to play the song? Then you suck. Let me call somebody else. I don't have to tell how to play the song. That's what we do. We're not supposed to have everybody feed us, so you hopefully, like when you got the call to do Ain't Too Proud, you had the wealth of knowledge already. You had played these songs. You were familiar with these songs. These songs were part of your DNA, right? Get me Clayton, because Clayton's going to be the shit. He's going to play the thing as it's supposed to be played. We don't have to hold him by the hand. We don't have to say this fill is inappropriate. We don't have to say, you're not playing strong enough, or you're not playing, whatever. Anyway, you get my point. You bring an authenticity to the chair. You bring your smarts, and the more capable you are, the more experience you've had, the more chairs you'll be able to fill convincingly on or on Broadway, or having nothing to do with Broadway.
You brought up something very interesting: creating a drum book for a musical. Michael Keller talked about this on the podcast when I interviewed him, and he said that's one of the more fun parts about creating a show, is that you get to be part of the whole creative process. And as you brought up, when you're starting a show, you didn't really bring it up, but I'm going to bring it up as well. You have a pianist who's usually the musical director, and they give you a piano vocal, and you have a drum set, and they're like 5, 6, 7, 8, and you're just going to go, and you don't have a drum part written out. So as you spoke about, having played jazz and, getting presented Gene Krupa's Sticks, meeting Buddy Rich, playing in front of Elvin Jones, playing in bands like Stuff, and sitting in at Mikell's and Manny's Car Wash and other places, you had a wealth of knowledge that you can just basically grab from and create a drum book on your own that is appropriate for the show that you're doing. And it's hard to get that learn all those different things and getting the language of music if you just gone to college and played musicals and then want to actually create a show.
Yes. Everybody listening, pay attention to what Clayton just said. It's profound.
Damian Bassman said something very similar. It's like, you have to go to the source of whatever. It's not really the same kind of thing, but he was talking about if you want to play In the Heights, you have to know how to play the music that inspired In the Heights. But that if you know how to play, Latin music and funk and disco and blues and jazz and country and fusion, again, when you want to create your own show, and if you get a call to do that, then you'll have all that in order to move forward. But let me ask you a question about creating a show. Did you create the show Footloose back in, I guess, 1998 and 1999?
I did. Yeah, that was a new show, and so when it's a new show, they have only let me see, the orchestrator was a guy named Tom Snow who had co-written a couple of songs on the Footloose, not the show, but the soundtrack and for the movie. Great guy, and but again, yeah, ultimately, well, with Footloose, you had songs that were recorded, not all of them, but a bunch of them. That was kind of a unique circumstance, though nobody told me what to play, and people were open, but you can't take that great drum part from the actual title track. And I messed with that just a little bit. In retrospect, I probably wouldn't have, because it's perfect as it is. It's Bo Diddley, but with a twist. And I think Tris Imboden played drums on the original, and Kenny Loggins is very specific about it. That said, Kenny Loggins came to the early rehearsals, and that started with like a drum flurry. Was it in there when you did the show? It started with just some drum stuff?
Yes.
Okay, so yeah, so you did this show too. So and then I started the beat, and the beat was a little different. It was very similar, but it was a little different than what was on the record, and they were fine with it. And Kenny was fine with it, and Tom was fine with it. Dean Pitchford, who had written the lyrics to every song that was in that show and every song that was in the movie and on the movie soundtrack, was the writer. And he was cool with it. So, yes, the answer is yes. I created that book. I get a little annoyed by that. The created that book, as you can probably tell, because
why?
Because I think there's a part of us I am of two minds about this, Clayton. There's the part of me that says that's exactly what we do every day as drummers, everywhere. So that we're suddenly congratulating ourselves and giving ourselves all this credit for playing parts that when you know the language, as you just articulated, should be intuitive, more or less, to the song that you're playing. It shouldn't be that big a deal that you're patting yourself on the back and going, look what I did, right? I created the book, as if you wrote the song. It's different, right? It's just a part. If you put the slashes and chord symbols, and you had a great guitar player come up with a part, he's creating the book too. But that's what we do as rhythm section players. I'm of that mind set, but then there's also a part of me that does understand that there are people paid large sums of money to take the creation you just made and essentially, could be transcribing it and putting it into those parts or things like it. And they're making money on it, and there's something to be said for that. So, that's one of those circumstances. But in most circumstances, you do have orchestrators and arrangers, and they are paid, and as sidemen aren't for coming up with their parts. Anyway,
it's not really a tangent, but it's interesting to think about it the way you said it. When you have a drum parts like Jeff Porcaro on Lowdown. He starts out the drum part, and it's there's 2 drum tracks on it. He's playing hi-hat, 16th note hi-hats on one side. And from what I understand from Larry Saltzman, he was talking about that on the podcast that he has, and how he was doing things to add things to it. But it's a signature part of the song to me. Mm-hmm. And just like the guitar part in My Girl, mm-hmm. that introduction was basically it's something that's it's a signature part. And should that guitar player who was a sideman at Motown, should he get writing credit for that? Great drum intros. Does the drummer get writing credit for that? Is it part of the song? No, but it's like you said, it's what we do as musicians, and whatever, like Steve Smith's part in "Don't Stop Believing." I mean, how unique is that? That's a big part of that song. Sure. Should he get songwriting credit for that? I don't necessarily think so, but it's like part of the song. It's just like you said, it's what we do. But at the same time, nowadays, from what I understand, if you're in the room and you say, hey, you're one of the 20 people that's supposed to get songwriting credits on a new song. It's like,
It's valid. It's a valid point. And also, from what I understand, I'm not educated in this particular area, but my understanding is that guys now, at times certainly, who are programming beats are getting writer's credit. Mm. So there's been a change. So that's something maybe to be paying attention to, because now it's being legitimized in a different area, in a different way. I mean, if you look at, let's say, 50 Ways to Leave Your Lover, that is right. Well, I mean, if it wasn't for that,
right?
And another drummer might have just come in and okay, boom, ba ba da 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 da.
That's what I would have done.
I would have done something, but certainly, Now, along those lines, who was it who gave Anthony Jackson writing credit?
Oh yeah, For the Love of Money.
Was that the Isleys?
Yeah.
Isleys? Yeah, they gave him credit.
The OJs.
I'm sorry. Yeah, OJs.
Yeah, he got songwriting credit for that. I mean, that's a part of that song. So yeah, where is the line drawn?
Yeah.
And it's funny. Maybe we should be saying that we're not just drummers. We make beats for Broadway musicals.
Well, there was a whole host of us at one point that sat down and made this case to 802, and I think made it very successfului. So when it came time, and this is the problem also, and this goes off on a tangent a little, but with each negotiation that comes up where there's an opportunity, what they're really fighting for is just to keep what you got, maybe get a little more so you can pay your medical bills. So it's negotiations with teams of lawyers, and yeah, but we need a higher contribution so we can have health insurance. And that kind of, that then you kind of, you go, okay, well, so let's pick our battles. And unfortunately, lower on the list is
so in other words, we're acting like pussycats. Maybe I should edit that out.
Yeah, well, it's important to us. It certainly is important to us. Oh, that's funny.
I don't know. Well, yeah, it's very interesting to talk about that stuff, but to be seen in the future. We'll see how that all turns out. But if you're doing a new show, if you're on a workshop of a show and you're in the room, you're creating stuff. There have been times where I think about, should I just, let them come up with the part? But I just can't do that. I just sit there, and the last workshop I did, again, I created the drum part. I'm just there to help the process along and be part of the creative team.
I hear you. I did a workshop, and then it became we went to Paper Mill. It was in Paper Mill. The show was called My Very Own British Invasion. Anyway, Lon Hoyt was the MD, and he did the very thing that I think was done at Waitress, which is I'm making you guys, I guess, orchestrators, technically. I'm making you guys orchestrators, and you're going to get a little piece of this. And he did. But it has to come from some powerful place. And if they do that, then whatever form it's going to, manifest itself in is potentially available. But it's a hard fight for a sideman alone. Yeah.
When you were doing Footloose, I mean, that wasn't your first show, but was it a longer running show than the first one that you did?
Oh yeah, it was the first show that I had that would have been considered a hit, because I think it ran. I could be wrong, but I think it ran the better part of 2 years. And even now, a show that runs a year is like a hit.
Did that kind of establish you in the scene?
I had done a one show in between. Well, I had done a couple shows in between, but one Broadway show in between called Street Corner Symphony. Street Corner Symphony was a Motown-ish review. It only ran for a few months, but the director was the guy who was responsible for 3 Motowners, and Marion Caffey, I think is it. Anyway, Lon Hoyt was the MD, and he brought me in, but Miller heard me play on that, had recommended me for an off-Broadway show, which I did, called Violet, which ultimately came to Broadway. And at that point, I had sort of established my ability to do this thing and do it in sort of more sort of... There were traditional shows, but these weren't traditional shows. These were rock, pop, funky, whatever, that umbrella is. And so that, yes, that's when Footloose came along. And I'll do that.
So it ran for the better part of 2 years. How did you go about keeping the show fresh?
So that's a good question. And I'm not sure there is an actual answer for that, but I'll give you the one that I can think of, which is...
If you like what you hear on the show, subscribe to the Broadway Drumming 101 newsletter at broadwaydrumming101.substack.com. That's Substack, substack.com. The Broadway Drumming 101 newsletter is your one-stop shop for everything you'll need to know about playing drums for Broadway musicals. When you subscribe to the newsletter, you'll learn about what it takes to be a successful pit musician, with content delivered directly to your email inbox 2 to 3 times a week. For $5 a month or $50 a year, you'll have a backstage pass to the world of a Broadway drummer playing on a hit show. As a paying subscriber, you'll receive behind-the-scenes access to the life of a musician who makes a living on Broadway. You'll also be able to read every post, not just those occasional free ones. You'll get access to all newsletter issues in the archives and have an ability to participate in subscriber-only comments and events. If you become a founding member for a gift of only $75, you'll receive discounted private drum lessons and a 25% discount on future promotional products. If you'd like to make a direct contribution to the production of this show, you can reach us at Venmo at Clayton-Craddock, Cash App at Syncopated, that's CINCOPATED, or PayPal at Clayton Craddock. Any amount of support will be appreciated. Thank you for listening.
How did you go about keeping the show fresh?
So that's a good question, and I'm not sure there is an actual answer for that. But I'll give you the one that I can think of, which is whenever you do a gig, you bring your whole self to the gig. If you ever feel like you're phoning something in, that's bad. That means you're not thinking, you're not focusing, and you're not keeping yourself to a standard, which is, Now, are you going to have good days and bad days? Probably. Are you going to have days where you feel better? Of course. But, I went to hear the Eagles about 6 months ago. They did the Hotel California tour. Hotel California from the 70s, right? And these guys, mostly speaking of 70s, are in their 70s. This band sounded unbelievably good. It couldn't have sounded better. It was one of the best concerts I ever saw. So how does that work? They're playing Life in the Fast Lane. There's a New Kid in Town. They're playing like all these songs that we listened to 50 years ago. So when you're talking about like you get a show, most shows don't see beyond a month or two. If you're lucky, they do, but most don't. But if they do, think about that shit. Think about guys who are fortunate enough to be in the position to be playing the same song, a year later, 2 years later, or even 4 years later. Not, forgetting about 40 years later. I would say, so yes, you bring your, how do you keep it fresh? The other part of it is get out of that hole under the stage, go play other gigs. It's not only just about getting out of the hole and staying home and just, chilling. I understand the value of that, but go play other gigs, lose money, lose money, because if that's what it takes, and it probably will, but ultimately you're feeding your soul, you're feeding your brain, you're developing, and you're bringing that to the show when you come back to it. You're going to make it sound a little better because you're a little fresher and you've got a little more, and you also have an overview in a way that you might have lost just sitting there day after day after day. So that's part of the secret, I think.
Is it kind of like absence makes the heart grow fonder?
I think so. And there's also, you can appreciate what you have, and you can contribute more to what you have if you're bringing in stuff that makes you better, that fed your soul, that made you this much better as a musician.
So speaking of better, November 15th, year 2000, I guess it was opening night of the Rocky Horror Show.
Oh my God, Clayton.
Just a wealth of knowledge here, man. It's all up in here. Every Broadway show, it's like, no, I'm just kidding.
Oh, man. You do your homework.
So tell me about the Rocky Horror Show.
Rocky Horror was the show after Footloose. It was the first show. There were some significant things about it for me. It seemed kind of fun because for obvious reasons. And then Joan Jett was in it. Dick Cavett was in it. They had all these guests in Dick Cavett's role. Dick Cavett was the narrator, and he would come and go. But then they would have like Penn and Teller and Sally Jesse Raphael and what's his name? The great. They had a bunch of great comedians. Anyway, but they had great singers in that show. Sebastian Bach came in at one point to do it. So it was rock and roll-ish from that era. Again, they said, do what you want to do with this. So, it was one of the first shows I remember thinking, and I know I've heard you speak about the Click before. And I'd like to talk about that for a second, but I had an orientation to the Click, and I found that when there's so many people who weigh in on how fast or how slow something is, and this felt faster, and everybody has their own, depending on how tired they are and how much they ate and whatever, what kind of mood they're in. Everybody has a different clock. I feel like in a Broadway circumstance, it's a problem solver. So I asked the MD at Rocky Horror if I could, me and Irio O'Farrell, the bass player, if we could listen to a click on these songs, if I could. So he was like, sure. So I would activate the click, and I was happier with it. On Footloose, there wasn't one. And in fact, when I asked for it for the recording sessions, I got absolutely not. I was like, you don't want to do this to a click? By the way, the music was done to a click, that we're playing, on those original songs. No, it's not what we do. So, okay. But how did we get to that? Oh, Rocky Horror. So, that ran until 9/11. And 9/11 closed any shows that were operating that weren't wildly successful at the time. If you were doing okay, it wasn't going to make it. It was a microcosm in terms of its longevity of what we experienced with COVID and obviously severe in its own way, but it, once it happened, then it was just a question of recovering, people going back, and it took them a while, and that was that. But it was a good experience.
You later went on, later in 2002, to be the drummer for a new show called Hairspray. How did you go about getting that show? Thank you for listening to the Broadway Drumming 101 podcast. Head over to the Broadway Drumming 101 YouTube page, where you'll find unedited conversations that I've had with some of your favorite musicians. On the YouTube page, you're going to find bonus content that I don't feature on my Instagram page or here on the podcast. Don't forget to subscribe and click on that little bell at the top so that you'll be notified when a new video is uploaded. Thank you for listening, and stay tuned for more.